Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, the first part of ACE AO5 webinar series 2017. Thank you for your time to join with us in this webinar series. I would like to introduce myself at first. My name is Damar, a technical officer from Policy Research and Analytics Program at ASEAN Center for Energy. And here I will be serving as your moderator in today's webinar. This webinar series is hosted by ASEAN Center for Energy with support for many dialogue partners that will be invited as our keynote speaker in this webinar. The webinar series is a series of webinars that will discuss on the key findings of the 5th ASEAN Energy Outlook. And this webinar will be held weekly every Wednesday since today up to 13 December 2017. And as we may know, the IO5 was produced by ASEAN Center for Energy, and it was published and launched in the 35th ASEAN Ministers on Energy meeting in Manila, Philippines, September this year. And the IO5 provides policymakers and the stakeholders in ASEAN with an understanding of mid and long-term energy and environmental related challenges up to 2040. And please be informed that this webinar series will be organized in 4 consecutive weeks with different themes adapted from the key findings that we find in our book, the 5th ASEAN Energy Outlook. The first one will be today's webinar, Future ASEAN Power Investment. And then the second webinar will be held on next week, the new era for gas import in ASEAN. And the title for the third one is the Renewable Energy Incentives. What are the next steps for ASEAN? That will be held around 6 December. And then for the fourth one, the last one is a nuclear coming or not to ASEAN in the 13th December. So in order to gain the whole key findings of the IO5, we really hope you all can join with all the series of our webinar as I outlined before. And here to welcome the speakers today. Actually, today we have 3 speakers from IA, also from Renewable, and also from ASEAN Center for Energy. And we would like to talk more about the future ASEAN power investment. And in here, I would like to maybe introduce first what is ACE. Actually, ACE was started in operation in 1st January 1999 as an intergovernmental organization that independently represents the 10 ASEAN member states' interests in energy sector. And then the vision of the center is as a catalyst for the economic growth and integration of the ASEAN region by initiating and facilitating multilateral collaboration as well as joint collective activity on energy. And then our mission is to accelerate the integration of energy strategies within the ASEAN and by providing relevant information and expertise to ensure the necessary energy policies and programs are in harmony with the economic growth and the environmental sustainability for the region. And we have 3 functions. The basic function is think as the energy think tank. The second one is the catalyst of to unify the strengthen the ASEAN energy cooperation and integration, and the third one is the ASEAN Energy Data Center. And back to our webinar. In this good day, we have 3 keynote speakers invited from IA, Renewable, and also ACE, ASEAN Center for Energy. And the first one is the Miss Badaria Yosiana, the manager for ASEAN German Energy Program in ASEAN Center for Energy. As you can see, that Ms. Badaria Yosiana has joined with ACE since 2014 and currently as the project manager for the ASEAN German Energy Program. And for the second one, we will have Professor Dr. Wolfgang Hemmer, head of Competence Center Energy Policy and energy markets. And then the third one, we will have Mr. Toshiyuki Shirai from the IEA, and he has many experience as the senior energy analyst in the World Energy Outlook since 2015, and he coordinated and co-led the work of World Energy Outlook Special Market Mexico Energy Outlook in 2016 and Southeast Asia Energy Outlook 2017. And that's all our speakers. I would like to thank and convey my heartfelt gratitude for all the contribution from the speaker to this webinar series. And for your information, this webinar will be divided into 4 parts. The first part is the session for Ms. Badaria Yusiana to present our IO5 findings in the power investment, and the second one is from Professor Wolfgang, and then third one from Mr. Toshiyuki Shirai. And the fourth one, the last one, we will have a discussion question from all of you. So as your active participation is very important throughout the session, please feel free to raise your question, and please indicate to whom the question and remarks will be addressed. As you can see that there is a board for the question in the hand right side of you, and you can address anytime, and I will select and address the question to all to the selected speakers. And then, without further ado, herewith, I would like to invite Ms. Badaria Yusiana as the first keynote speaker in this webinar series. So, please welcome Ms. Badaria Yusiana. Time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Damar, for your kind introduction. Okay, let me show my screen first. Okay. Okay, so good day to everyone, wherever you are. As Damar mentions that my name is Badaria Yusiana, and I'm the manager of the ASEAN German Energy Program at ASEAN Center for Energy. So at this very good occasion, I would like to share with you some of our insight from our latest publication, the 5th ASEAN Energy Outlook. And yeah, since this is this webinar will be a series of webinar, and today's we will pretty much focus on the power investment. But before going to the detail of our findings, yeah, I would like to share with you that our 5th ASEAN Energy Outlook has been launched in the occasion of AMEM meeting, the ASEAN Ministers on Energy meeting last September in Manila, and it was launched by Secretary Kusi, the Secretary of Energy of the Philippines. And here is some of the photos during the launching event. Okay, so since this is the first series of the webinar, I think I will try to give you a little bit introductions on our approach when we develop the ASEAN Energy Outlook. So we use 4 approaches in developing the outlook, but what I want to emphasize that this outlook was developed based on remarkably strong cooperation, coordination, interaction, and integration between ACE, the AO5 working group from 10 ASEAN member states, and of course with the technical assistance from Fraunhofer ISI, and yeah, Professor Wolfgang will speak after me. And yeah, all the data process and the results that we use and all the findings that were reported, this data process and result were reported with our ASEAN Regional Policy and Planning Subsector Network for their validation and confirmations, and also their guidelines were used to be for the alignment with our region's priorities and goals under the ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation. And here are the 3 scenarios that we use for the outlook. So the first is a business as usual scenarios. It basically taking into consideration that there are no significant changes to the past practices, but please note that under these BAU scenarios, we also take into consideration the latest national power development plans and primary production of fossil fuels and refineries. And the second scenario is the IMS target scenarios. So it assumes that officially energy policies and targets of the national level are fully attained. And the last scenarios is the ASEAN progressive scenarios. So under this, we assume that a higher ambition level, especially in energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies, where the APAEC targets on EE and RE are fully attained. For those of you who are not really familiar with these APAEC targets in ASEAN, so ASEAN basically has aspirational targets to achieve 23% of renewable energy share into our total primary energy mix, and to also reduce the energy intensity by 20% by 2020. Okay, so these are some of the historical data of the ASEAN energy landscape, focusing on power capacity. So as you can see that from 2005 to 2015, the power capacity in ASEAN is growing significantly, almost double, more than double. And also we predicted under the BAU scenarios, the power capacity in ASEAN will keep growing. We assume that by 2025, the ASEAN will have around 321 gigawatt installed power capacity. And as you can see from this chart that 5 countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam, are the biggest contributor in the regions. They, 5 of them accounted for around 90% of the total power capacity in the region. And here are some of our results. As I mentioned before, the ASEAN has this 23% of reaching the renewable energy targets. So we do some calculations how much the added capacity is needed under these 3 scenarios and how much the investment will be needed. So as you can see here that under the BAU scenarios, the ASEAN will need around 120 gigawatt additional capacity, and that will take into account around 160 US billion for the investment. And as you can see that from the BAU, most of the power plant, the additional one, will be on fossil fuel. So around 51% of the new power capacity will be coming from the fossil fuel. And from the ATS and APS scenarios, you can see from the figure that we expect to have more renewable energy into the power systems. And for ASEAN to achieve the APAEC target under the APS scenarios, around the regions will need, it will cost, so the incremental cost is around 1.3 billion. So that means if we compare that to the ASEAN's GDP, for ASEAN to reach the 23% of renewable energy targets, it will need around 0.9% of ASEAN's GDP in 2015. And here are the breakdown of each countries for the renewable energy power plants that they need to have in 2025 in order to achieve the 23% renewable energy target. So as you can see here that Indonesia and Vietnam are the driver for the regions to achieve its targets. And as you can see also that the variable renewable energy, specifically for solar and wind, will also be the key instead beside hydropower. And what about the investment and the additional power beyond the APAEC targets until 2040? So we also do some calculations, and the ASEAN in 2040 under the BAU scenarios, the installed power capacity from what we have today in 2015, we will grow 3 times. And what is important to note that by having more energy efficiency as shown by ATS and APS scenarios, actually we could reduce the installed power capacity requirements. So by fulfilling the ATS and APS scenarios, we could actually lower the power capacity by 2.7 times. And as you can see in the right figure, in the right hand side, the breakdown or the details of the renewable energy. And as you can see, this is also quite the same with what we predict by 2025. So within the ATS and APS scenarios, we will see more and more variable renewable energy into the power grid. And what about the investment needed for this? So from this figure, it is showed that to achieve the more renewable energy technology into the power system, actually the investment needed are lower than what is needed in BAU. So that means for ASEAN, if it wants to be more, let's say, to have more renewable energy into the grid, actually the investment needed are less than what we have in the BAU. So as a conclusion, the ASEAN vast expanding economies and growing population means a rising of energy resources, and that means also in the electricity power. But however, as I mentioned before, that the enhanced efficiency that is shown by ATS and APS scenario could actually lower the capacity requirements. And the power sector is one of the most significant sector for the region to achieve its aspirational goal on renewable energy. And as I mentioned before, that for ASEAN to achieve its APAIC targets, the allocation of USD 21.4 billion annually, or about 0.9% of its GDP in 2015 is needed. And for longer period beyond APAIC horizon until 2040, more renewable energy integration could be achieved with lower investment that could also bring more benefits that could lead also to our sustainability. And I think that was my last slide. And this the 5th ASEAN Energy Outlook report is available in our website, so you could download it. And yeah, thank you, Damar. I'll give it the floor back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Badaria Yosiana from ASEAN Center for Energy. That's very interesting that we know that about 1.3 billion annually for the ASEAN needs up to 2025 as incremental from the ASEAN target scenario, or equal to 0.8% of their GDP. And Indonesia and Vietnam will be very dominant in this contribution. And then the next presenter, I would like to invite Professor Wolfgang Ehemer from Fraunhofer, who would like to share with us about the comparison between ASEAN and the European Union. So please welcome Mr. Professor Ehemer.
Yes, hello, Wolfgang Eichhammer speaking. Okay, I have switched to my screen. Can everyone see it?
Yes, please.
Okay, perfect. Then I would like to start. Sorry. Do you see just the screen, or do you also see the control panel here? Okay, I will start. So my presentation is about power investment schemes in the European Union, and my organization is Fraunhofer ISI in Germany, which is a society for applied research, and I'm also attached to Utrecht University in the Netherlands as a professor. Before I would like to focus on Europe, let me very briefly state what Mrs. Badaria has already mentioned, our involvement in the 5th ASEAN Energy Outlook. A major effort which we are doing is about energy system modeling, and our clients work, for example, at national ministries in Germany. They work in companies. We work for the European Commission, and also in this case we did energy system modeling for the 5th ASEAN Energy Outlook. Now, coming to the focus of my presentation here, having a look at investments with a focus on European Union. But let me first have a global look at investments in renewables. We will hear more about that in the following presentation. Today, already more than half of all new investments worldwide are made in renewable energy sources, and from a European perspective, this share is even higher, now around 80% of all new power sector investments are occurring in the renewable energy sector. This shows that renewables really are now a mainstream evolution on a worldwide level. For sure, the share, as you see from the lower green curves, the share of renewables in global power capacity, which is around 16%, and in global power generation, which is around 11%. This still reflects the past, but is rapidly growing, and as said, with more than half of all investments occurring in renewables, the share of renewables is rapidly increasing on a worldwide level. Now, how is this has been occurring in Europe? Europe had a relatively early start in the investments, and you see in this curve different regions, and you see the European investments in dark blue, and they have been relatively high over time. There has been a maximum of investments in the years 2011, 2012, some dip with the economic crisis, and then some kind of stabilization. And you see other regions of the world like China, for example, where the investments have been growing quite rapidly. Now, what does this curve reflect in Europe? In fact, there are two effects that are occurring. The installed megawatts in Europe have been increasing steadily. You will see that in further slides. While on the other hand, investments, specific investments, the learning cost of the different technologies like PV and wind energy have been bringing down specific costs of the technologies, and hence the overall investments have been decreasing despite a growing number of megawatts installed. So this reflects higher efficiencies in economic terms in renewable energy investments. Now, how are they distributed, these investments in Europe? And you see from the mainstream renewables like solar and in particular wind, a lot of this is large-scale asset finance, but in the solar field, the small distributors are still relatively strongly present. I will come to this point also a bit later on, whether this trend will still maintain in the future, or whether the large utility scale asset financing will be the major trend present. Here you see a snapshot for 2016 of different European countries, and to the right-hand side you see the investments for the same year for ASEAN countries. In Europe, in particular, in 3 countries, investments are comparatively high. In United Kingdom, Germany, and Belgium. I must say that this may vary from year to year because it's relatively strongly dominated by investments into offshore wind energy, which can vary relatively considerably among the years. but it shows that compared to ASEAN region, still in a larger number of European countries, investments are strong, but relatively uneven if you compare, for example, a country like France, which is, let's say, roughly speaking about the same size as Germany is, or Italy. There is quite a lot of difference between the investments undertaken in the countries, and this shows that there is considerably scope for further penetration of renewable energy sources in different regions of Europe. I already talked about the cost degradation of renewables, and this has been considerable over the recent time, but projections even show that the cost degradation will continue, and you see here a view from Bloomberg New Energy Finance up to 2040, and the specific investments per megawatt hour will fall in the ranges well below $40 per megawatt hour, while you see, for example, for coal, the dark black line, this will be considerably higher, and it shows the increasing competitiveness of renewable energy sources after 2020. Now, what has been main financing schemes in Europe, and I cannot focus in broad aspects on these, but just to take up the most recent financing instruments, which were tenders, and I show here the example of offshore and onshore wind tenders up to 2020. And you see just a few years being presented here since 2013 to 2017, and in the perspective of 2020, because a number of these plants that will come up in the next 3 years have already received permit and have already undergone tender procedures, and you see that the tender price the tender system has exerted a very strong pressure on the prices, which have been dropping from levels of, let's say, around 120 to 160 euro per megawatt hour, down to levels of around 50 to 60 at present. And this trend will continue. So this has been a very successful financing instrument here. Let me come to the question back whether decentral or central systems will be the major technology in Europe. I pointed in particular to PV, and in combination with that, you see here the cost of lithium-ion batteries, which have been falling by a factor of by 73% since 2010, and which are expected to fall by another factor of 4 up to 2030. And there can be an increasing trend when this continues, that people are using energy storage systems in combination with decentral PV system in order to generate electricity themselves. This is a kind of societal trend. I would say people could like that. In Europe, you observe that increasingly, and if the costs are falling further, this can be a very global trend. But this is still relatively uncertain between, let's say, a more decentral or a more central organization of the renewable energy system in the future. Let me come to a final point here I would like to make in the investments. So far, a lot of the investments have been taken in technology, and here you see the example of wind energy that has been penetrating relatively steadily in Europe. You see here both the installed gigawatt of onshore wind and offshore wind. And together today, the level of 150 gigawatt is reached in Europe, and projections to 2030 on average see more than a doubling of this to about 325 gigawatt. However, the technology costs have been falling, as you have been seeing. So the additional costs as compared to, let's say, the traditional technologies, gas, coal, for example, is not very substantial anymore. And the major investments that have, the differential investments that have to be taken in the future is in strengthening the power systems, strengthening the interconnections, enhancing the power lines. We have now reached in Europe a renewable energy share of 30% by 2017 in the power sector, and in the next 15 years we will approach around 50%. And in that range, it's not anymore the technology penetration which is the most important, but it's the integration of the fluctuating renewable energy sources into the power system, which requires most of the additional investments in Europe. And finally, let me emphasize, this is a slide from the AEO5 outlook, but it very similar holds also for Europe. Josiana already emphasized the role of energy efficiency. It is very important when renewables are penetrating in the power system to strengthen at the same time energy efficiency options, because this has a positive impact on interconnections which are necessary, power transmission lines in cases of more central renewable energy systems. There is a lot of, I would say, acceptance issues, resistance, if power lines are very present in the daily life. So the less energy we consume, the less power lines we have to draw, and the higher the acceptability for the penetration of renewable energy sources. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Wolfgang Hammer. So without further ado, I would like to invite to Mr. Toshiyuki Shirai, Senior Energy Analyst from International Energy Agency, who will present to us about the trends of global power investment and prospective power investment schemes for the ASEAN. So please welcome Mr. Toshiyuki Shirai.
Hello, everyone. Well, once again, thank you very much for providing me this opportunity. Today, I'd like to talk about, sorry, yes, I think now everyone can see my slides now. Okay, once again, thank you very much. Today, I'd like to talk about Southeast Asia Energy Outlook with a focus on investment and power sector outlook. Let me start by explaining the weight of Southeast Asia in the global energy system. Southeast Asia is a rising heavyweight in global energy landscape. Since 2000, strong economic and demographic growth has pushed up Southeast Asia's energy demand by 60%. But per capita primary energy demand is still about half of the world average, leaving strong scope for further growth. In our outlook to 2040, we can see the geography of global energy consumption changing. In developed economies such as United States, EU, and Japan, energy demand is increasingly decoupled with economic growth, leading to reduction in energy demand. On the other hand, substantial energy demand growth comes from Asia, namely India, China, and Southeast Asia. These three regions account for almost 60% of global energy demand growth to 2040, and Southeast Asia accounts for 10% of the global energy demand growth. And in Southeast Asia, we see the robust growth in final consumption of energy, especially in electricity demand. Electricity demand grows rapidly, accounting for the largest growth in final consumption in Southeast Asia. In this region, electricity consumption more than doubles, growing at a rate that is almost twice as fast as the world average. This is largely due to increased consumption of electricity in the building sector. Rising ownership of appliances, underpinned by urbanization and rising incomes, results in electricity demand in the building sector more than doubling by 2040. As a result, the Southeast Southeast Asia becomes the third largest contributor to the global power demand growth by 2040, next to China and India. Global power generation grows by around 60% by 2040, and renewable-based generation provides the largest growth to 2040, becoming the largest source of power by 2040 on a worldwide basis. In Southeast Asia, on the other hand, the relative affordability and resource abundance of coal makes it the largest source of power by 2040. And the coal accounts for around 40% of the power mix in 2040. But the other major trend in Southeast Asia is the rise in renewables, enabled by the significant reduction in cost that we have seen around the world. As a group, renewable takes second spot in the generation mix. Many countries in Southeast Asia have announced plans to boost renewable-based energy deployment. As a result, the power generation from renewables quadrupled by 2040, reaching a share of 30% in the power mix. So how much investment is necessary to realize this outlook? In the world, cumulative energy investment to 2040 reaches around $60 trillion, of which power sector accounts for around $20 trillion, and investment in non-fossil fuel power generation, which is mainly for renewables, capture around 15% of the total investment. In Southeast Asia, $2.7 trillion of cumulative investment is necessary, which is around $110 billion on an annual basis. Reflecting the need to meet rising electricity demand, investment in power sector accounts for roughly 50% of the total energy investment. In Southeast Asia, investment in non-fossil fuel power generation plants, mainly for renewables, accounts for around 12% of the total investment. So far, I have explained the projection in our main scenario, which is called the New Policy Scenario, NPS, which I guess is very much similar to ATS scenario in ACE Outlook. In this main scenario, primary energy demand grows rapidly in Southeast Asia by 2/3 by 2040, and coal leads the way to provide about 40% of expanding energy demand by 2040. In this scenario, CO2 emission continues to grow by 75% to 2040. To illustrate more secure and sustainable paths, we have set up another scenario called Sustainable Development Scenario, SDS. This scenario assumes that the region achieves some of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, such as CO2 emission trajectories in line with Paris Agreement, universal energy access by 2030, and drastic reduction in air pollution. In this scenario, primary energy demand in 2040 is around 16% lower than the main scenario, underpinned by more stringent efficiency policies. The share of renewables is also larger, with enhanced support measures and further cost reduction in technologies. In this outlook, renewable makes up about 40% of primary energy demand, and the share of coal is reduced to 9% in 2040. And this translates into about a 50% reduction in CO2 emission compared with the main scenario. And if we compare the cumulative investment to 2040 between the two scenarios, the difference in overall spending is relatively small, but there would need to be a profound shift in the pattern of spending towards renewables and efficiency. This reallocation of investment brings multiple benefits. Firstly, by virtue of reduced demand in transport, the region needs to import less oil, saving $180 billion of the import bill in 2040. In addition, the cleaner use of energy has benefits to human health, cutting by 2/3 the number of premature deaths from indoor and outdoor air pollution. Now, I'd like to take a closer look at the implications for power sector investment. In the power sector, an annual average investment of around $25 billion is needed for power generation plants by 2040. This is for our main scenario, and $25 billion investment means that the investment requirements is around 40% higher than the investment level in 2016. Over half of this investment goes to renewables, but the investment is also needed for coal-fired power plants, especially for efficient advanced coal technologies. The large penetration of renewables and wider deployment of efficient coal deliver a decline of around 20% in carbon intensity, but this remains significantly higher than the world average. In the Sustainable Development scenario, the annual average investment of over $35 billion is needed for power plants, almost twice as large as the investment level in 2016. Around 85% of the investment goes to renewables, while investment for coal plants is substantially reduced. The net impact of reduced coal and increased renewables is the carbon intensity in power sector declining by around 75% by 2040. So let me wrap up my presentation. We are certain that the Southeast Asia will become an increasingly important actor in the global energy system. The new policy initiatives help the region to diversify the power generation mix. But CO2 emission and net import of fuels continue to rise to 2040, meaning that the region still faces significant environmental and security challenges. And energy investment needs to be scaled up in the coming decades from the current levels. Especially, investment for power sector need to be scaled up to meet soaring demand. This requires more private participation and cooperation with international financing institutions. Developing effective policy framework and incentive is also an essential factor. Reforming fossil fuel subsidies is also important to improve investment climate. And as illustrated by Sustainable Development scenario, capital needs to shift from fossil fuel supply to efficiency and renewables if countries in Southeast Asia are to move towards achieving sustainable development goals. This is all for my presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toshiyuki Shirai. That's very interesting to have all the presentation from the speakers. And now we have 15 minutes left to discuss and address the questions from the floor to the speakers. If you have any question, just please chat to me directly or put your question in the question window in the right hand side. And for the first question we have here, maybe this question will be addressed to Ms. Badaria Yusiana and also Professor Wolfgang and also Mr. Tosi, if you have any ideas for this. How is ASEAN member state public sector incentivize involvement or engagement of the private financial institution to contribute in power investment? Because the power itself is very interesting and has the potential, big potential in the near future. So maybe the time first, I would like to give to Ms. Badaria Siana as the first speaker, and then we would like to hear from the others.
Okay, thanks very much, Damar, for the question. So if I hear it correctly, so what is the incentives that is provided to the private sectors in terms of power sector? Is that correct?
Yes,
Yes. Okay.
especially in particularly the financial institution, the private.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, like, the ASEAN is actually a hungry regions in terms of electricity. So for the regions to able to fully cover this huge electricity demand, of course, the private sectors are very much needed. And yeah, like in most of the ASEAN countries, what we know as an individual power producers or IPP is already accommodated by the country. So even though most of the ASEAN has like one single buyer, like one utilities companies, except Singapore and Philippines, the private sector's contributions is well known. And in terms of the incentives, take an example of Indonesia, for example. Some of the fast track programs are provided by the country, so actually it somehow reducing all these permit and procedures for the private sectors if they want to be part of the power sector project. And also some of the fiscal incentives are provided in most of the ASEAN countries. So for example, tax holiday, and also free import duties for certain technology, and not only for renewables, but also some of these fossil fuel technology could also enjoy this free import duties to some extent. And talking about the renewable energy technology, of course, the feed-in tariffs are pretty much available in most of the ASEAN countries, and that the feed-in tariff could give the private sector's guarantee up to 20 years with a fixed income, so that it could give them a security to invest in the renewable energy project. And also there are other incentives, for example, like reduction of corporate income taxes. So for example, like Thailand, they give, like in the first 7 years, instead of 30% of the corporate taxes, they will give you a discount like up to 15%, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, there has been several of the incentives provided by the governments, you know, to engage more or to attract more the private sectors to invest more in power sectors.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe is there any other point of view from Mr. Tosi?
Okay. Can I speak now?
Please, sir, please.
Okay. So I totally agree with Ms. Yoshiana just said, but I just would like to supplement a couple of points. First, in Southeast Asia, still there are a significant amount of fossil fuel subsidies prevailing. In our analysis, around $9 billion was spent in 2016 to subsidize electricity. So removing this electricity subsidy provides help the region to have a more clear investment climate, which helps the private sector to have a more clear picture in the project development. And also providing a government guarantee to reduce risk of the project is also very much important factor to incentivize the private investment. And another point would be the market liberalization. And as Ms. Yoshiana said, still a single buyer model is a very much dominant system in the power sector market in Southeast Asia. And I believe there may be much more room for private sector to participate in the power sector market by liberalizing not only the generation side, but also to a retail side and etc. And as to renewable investment, as I understand correctly, There are 5 countries in Southeast Asia to implement feed-in tariffs. And of course, feed-in tariffs is a good system to incentivize investment in renewables by providing a clear picture of the future revenue stream. But also, I'd like to point out the need to introduce an auction system, especially for utility-scale solar PV. And globally, as many as 70 countries already introduced auctions. So this might be the area of where a Southeast Asia government can explore further to incentivize investment in renewables. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tosi, for the reply. And then for Mr. Professor Wolfgang, do you have any other idea for the question?
Yeah, let me comment from a European perspective. Feed-in tariffs, as just mentioned, have been very successful in Europe to spur the early penetration of technology. The feed-in system provided a long-term stability to the investors, which has been very important. But now, as renewables are approaching the market, I also would like to emphasize the role of auction systems, well-designed auction systems. And here, I think one should explore still how to make auction systems efficient in the ASEAN context, because when we had meetings in AMEM recently in September, we saw presentations that the prices or the costs for renewable energy systems in ASEAN region still are higher as we see currently, for example, in European countries, even if the natural conditions like sunshine and the wind conditions are better than for some countries in Europe. So I think really the design of such auction schemes should receive a lot of attention to make them as efficient as possible to ease penetration of renewable energy sources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Wolfgang. And then for the next question, is there any gaps for the power investment in ASEAN? And maybe if any numbers for the IR for the investors, so could you explain more about that? Maybe we could start and address this question to Ms. Yosi. Is there any gap for the power investment in ASEAN?
Do you mean the gap for fulfilling the outlook, or?
Maybe for this one, yes, as that one. Yes, Ms.
Okay,
yes, Mrs.
Okay, so yes, I mean, with this outlook, we calculate how much the investment needed for ASEAN to achieve first its national targets with under the ATS scenarios, and if ASEAN want to further achieve the 23% targets under the APAIC targets. And I mean, talking about the gaps, in order to fulfill the outlook, I mean, the calculations show that for ASEAN to achieve the APAIC targets, they need to invest around 0.9% of 2015 GDP. And yes, but in the outlook, we haven't calculated like how much is the gap. But I think seeing this, the investment done by the ASEAN, I think there are still very much rooms for ASEAN to invest more, and especially in terms of renewable energy technology.
Okay, thank you for the explanation. And there is another question here to Mr. Tosi. In the presentation, there is a nuclear capacity in the Southeast Asia. So maybe you could explain which country will be the first one to have a nuclear power plant, and how much the investment maybe.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Our main scenario is guided by the power plans published by each government or each power company in the regions. So we take into consideration the power development plan in Thailand for this nuclear power generation. In their power development plan, they assume to have 2 gigawatts of nuclear power plants late in 2030s. So we incorporate that plan and reflect to reflect in the power generation for predictions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tosi. And how may we know how much the number in your prediction for the investment for the nuclear?
Yes, it amounts to about $9 billion as a cumulative terms.
$9 billion. For how many megawatts, if we may know in
for 2 gigawatts.
2 gigawatts. Okay.
Yeah.
For the next question, we have one for maybe as we know that ASEAN will have many renewable energy, and as we know that renewable energy is intermittent, and we need the energy storage. Maybe from the perspective of ASEAN Center for Energy, is there any number to present how many investment for the energy storage to fulfill the amount of solar and wind or other variable renewable energy that ASEAN will build in the future? Maybe this question is addressed to Ms. Yossi.
Okay, so in terms of storage, unfortunately in this outlook, we haven't put into considerations on the storage specifically, but we calculate the investment needed for the intermittent renewable energy technology, especially for solar and wind. But yeah, unfortunately, we haven't calculated the storage for the investment.
Okay, thank you very much. I think unfortunately we have a limited time to discuss more about the power investment, but it's very interesting. I know. I hope we could have more time to discuss about this. And I would like to recap before I close this webinar that some points that we make in here that Southeast Asia has investment for the power is about 1% of their GDP to reach the aspirational target. And then we also see that there are so many RE inside the projection, about 40%, and Indonesia and Vietnam are the most countries contributing in the renewable energy. And we could see that from the Southeast Asia Outlook also, it's similar with the ASEAN Center for Energy Outlook, the 5th ASEAN Energy Outlook, that about renewable energy is more dominant in the scenario up to 2040, and then maybe as the second one in the target scenario, coal and solar maybe is a little bit similar, but renewable energy is more than conventional energy at that time in 2040, and more investment will be also made by Southeast Asia in the future towards their aspirational target in sustainable energy. And then we could learn also from the Europe that there are 30% renewable energy in 2017, and then Europe also would like to develop more of onshore and offshore wind. Amounted in total is about 300 gigawatts, so it's very amazing. And we could also learn that the better strategy is another consideration for the Southeast Asia to improve the renewable energy in the future. And I think I would like to convey all the thanks for Ms. Badaria Yosiana, Mr. Tosi, and also Professor Wolfgang Ehemer from Fraunhofer. Thank you very much for your presentation today. That's very good. And please be informed that we will conduct the next webinar series for the IO5 key findings that will be conducted in the next week about the natural gas, the new era of gas imports in ASEAN. So yeah, please be there, and looking forward for your participation. And I'm Damar here, conveying my valuable gratitude to all the speakers and all participants here, and we look forward to seeing you in the next webinar. And sorry for all the missings in the webinar. Thank you, and see you next week. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.